This past week, I appreciated y'all's prayers. I I was in I was with Ukrainian staff from Campus Crusade for Christ, and and all of you can speak Ukrainian, and you realize that says, "Hello, Christ Covenant Church. How are you all doing?" No, really, what it says is, "Pray for Ukraine." And they all signed it. The leadership team signed it and gave that to me, and so I wasn't sure what to do with it. So I thought I'd just show it to you before it gets put in a drawer somewhere. But what a brave bunch of people. I I, I complain about I complain if the line's too long at Wendy's. And these people are living. Some of them many of them have already moved from the different parts of the country, but most of them are going back. All of the staff, there's 125 crew staff that work with Ukraine, and most of them stayed in country. Some of them went to Hungary to work with the refugees. A few of them went back home. Um, if you're a male and a Ukrainian citizen between the age of 20 and 60, you can't leave the country because um, it's martial law and they have the right to draft you into the army. And so, but it's a brave group of people. They love Jesus. Staff has increased since the war. The number of people sharing Christ and kind of working for that ministry has increased since the war started, not gone down, which just fascinated me. So what a privilege this week to talk about them. And it's funny. I told him that when you're in prolonged places of stress and trauma, God built our bodies in such a way to protect us, making us a little more anxious than not. Remember when we talked about that with anxiety, even depression. We're wired by God to not be impacted by the fallen world so quickly, and we've got a little bit of resilience against depression. If you'll remember, I talked about serotonin and reuptake inhibitors, and that system that God built in us is a system set up to keep you from being depressed. The problem is that once it shifts, that system gets hijacked for the wrong direction. So the person who's a little bit anxious, because that's healthy, if they've had a lot of ongoing regular trauma and anxiety, that gets recalibrated, and so they're more anxious all the time. Um, the once somebody's serotonin gets kind of shifted, the momentum it's harder to shift that momentum because the system is meant to protect you, but it can also be used. It's really a system that God put in place to kind of keep the momentum going in the right direction. But if the momentum starts going in the wrong direction, that same system makes it harder to get out of depression. And that's why if you know somebody who's really clinically depressed, you say, well, just quit it. Quit being depressed. That's like saying, don't let your hair grow. They just gotta go, I can't help that. But so part of what I talked with them about, I met with them every morning and we looked at the book of Lamentations together. But then we said, so what are some of the disorders that will show up because you're in a war zone? And of course, we've talked about some of those. We've talked about anxiety because you don't have much control. And it was like someone turned on a light. It was like, oh my goodness, that helps me understand what's going on with me, why I can't sleep at night, why I can't, because we've had so many bombs wake us up in our sleep. We've had so much happen that we're all anxious all the time. And so it was helpful for them to kind of hear about anxiety in the way that we've talked about it in here. It was helpful for them to hear about depression the way we've talked about it in here, because it all of a sudden they go, okay, we're not crazy. We're struggling, but we're not crazy. And that's really the stance that a lament has. When you go before God, what God's given us to help us go through difficult times is not a promise of easy. What he's given us is, I will be with you, and you can bring anything before me. And so I actually, part of the teaching, went through the book of Lamentations, and part of the teaching was at the end of the week, they were supposed to write a lament. And those are much more powerful than you can possibly imagine. That kind of a lament when they're not grieving, I wish I had leather seats. It's, I hope my nephew that just went into the Army is alive when we get back. I mean, that's, and so, from my perspective, I'm a little embarrassed going, gee, I feel like I have a cold today. I mean, there's almost, oh my goodness, Lord. But, so it was just a powerful time. But the third thing I told them, I said, not only will you sometimes struggle with anxiety because of the war zone, not only will you struggle with depression, you'll also struggle with addictions and other numbing issues because the present life you live in is very, very difficult to stay present in. And so we talked about fancy words like dissociation and addiction. And so tonight we're going to look at addiction as it's kind of what's a Christian response to addiction, and it's really fascinating what's happened in our world. And whenever I get a chance to talk in a secular setting, but there was a very liberal college in Orlando called Rollins, and it's a very liberal arts. I mean, you couldn't. I mean, they make. I mean, they would make a Vermontan priest look a priest in Vermont look like a right-wing radio host. I mean, they are just incredibly liberal place. But I knew one of the professors, and she would often invite me to come speak because to them the idea of a Christian psychologist or a Christian who kind of talked about these things was just, and so I always started with this statement, and it got them all mad. And then I would have said, well, listen, I know we probably disagree about a lot of things. And I've been introduced as an evangelical Christian, and so I know that, but let's just agree on one thing, that the most successful addiction treatment program in the world is a spiritually based addiction program. And so we all can agree on that. And so let's just start with that, and then we'll just kind of talk about. So what I would always say to these people is I would say, let's agree on that. And they would get upset. And it would be like, no. And I said, well, Alcoholics Anonymous begins by saying that something has overtaken you, if you will, and a power greater than yourself needs to help you. So it starts by saying you're in trouble and you need something bigger than you to get out. And so it's a spiritual program. And they it's like they don't want to acknowledge that. They want to acknowledge that they don't want to acknowledge the biggest problem with secular psychology is their view of man. We are not a high form of animal. We are a low form of angel. And that's not just a bumper sticker. That is an incredibly different way of understanding people. If I'm an image bearer of God, then there's dignity I deserve. There's a system in place where if you're fearfully and wonderfully made, there's something that has gone wrong in that system that we can try to understand and look at, as opposed to, we're just a high form of animal doing the best we can. And so I would almost take any counselor who begins with the premise of that I know man's depravity, I understand sin, but the most true thing about a person is you have creation on your side, and that's that you're made in the image of God. Now, it's also just that much above the deepest thing about you is you're also an incredible sinner that's totally depraved. So that dance is the dance that you have to have discernment of. So, but the system that we're going to talk about today has to do with the issue of addiction. And ultimately, addiction, remember we've said everything is nature, nurture, and choice. And that's the big debate. If you go to a regular treatment center in America for addiction, what they'll do is they say, we follow the disease model. And they'll say that alcoholism or addiction is a disease. And that makes that makes me nervous sometimes. I say, but the reason they say it's a disease is because there is a nature piece to it. The reward system in your brain that God put there. God put a reward system in your brain that is supposed to increase in an image bearer of God. When the system is working correctly, the system is supposed to encourage positive social things. So if I kiss my wife, endorphins will be released. If I exercise, though, I don't know this firsthand. I've just heard about this. You know, a runner's high. You know, it's like Charlie, you and I are together. I ran the New York City Marathon, and I guarantee you, none of the time was there any high anywhere in that. And if you ever see me running again, call the police. Someone has a gun to my head. We might finish today. If you've not heard the story of my story of the New York City Marathon, I may finish with that today. It's kind of a funny story. But the idea, if when you think about addiction and when you think about what we're going to be talking about, today, God built the system to reward behaviors like exercising, in warmth. If you make love to your wife or your husband, that creates endorphins. There's a release of those things. Well, what happens? There's a reward system that God has built inside your brain to reward those behaviors that He designed in us to enjoy. Now, what happens with the endorphins fill the same neurotransmitter spaces in the brain that thank you so much. The same neurotransmitter places in the brain that that heroin does, or opiates. And so when those things are being released, you really feel. There is something that encourages that behavior to continue. And so when they talk about it being a disease model, what they're saying is it follows the definition of a disease. A disease, if not treated, will get worse. And a disease has a predictable outcome once it's diagnosed. And most doctors and nurses would agree with the idea that, a disease has prescribed where it's going to go if it's not treated, and it needs, and addiction is like that. If you are truly addicted, you can predict where that's going to go. And if you're truly addicted and that reward system of the brain has been hijacked, without treatment, without you facing that, you're gonna have problems. Well, that makes us nervous because, wait a minute, I don't have an alcoholism gene, do I? It's like no, but like everything else, it's not a complete even playing field. Some people are more susceptible to, for example, alcoholism. You can be relatively healthy and be a heavy drinker and never be addicted. And you know what they say about Presbyterians, that wherever there's 4 Presbyterians, there's always a 5th. That's just a joke. That is my second alcohol joke tonight. So if you're keeping track, you might start saying, if we get to 4, we're going to be worried. But the idea, the idea when that reward system gets hijacked, you just need to be aware that creates a different kind of energy. It makes you more likely to relapse. It makes you more likely to struggle with that, and just be aware of that. And so that's part of why people will say to you, most people that are addicts will say, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this anymore. I got to stop. I need to stop. I'm trying to stop. And most people who are true addicts have tried to stop dozens of times. As a matter of fact, one of the signs that it's an addiction is an inability to stop even though there's a desire to. And so that's biological piece, nature, nurture. Now remember, I get excited about this because I think this gives us so many more categories to talk to people about when we're discipling them. But the nurture piece is, well, let me just talk about that for a second. This afternoon, my wife and I and Skylar, after church, we decided to try a restaurant that I want to be good but has never been good. We went to Ruby Tuesdays, and they're in Lenore City. And I, when I was in college in the 70s, there was the first Ruby Tuesdays down on the Strip, and it was great. Or maybe I was just young and I didn't know any difference, but I remember thinking, this is the greatest restaurant in the world. And we would sit down there with just a bunch of college students and read our Bibles, and it was just great. And so didn't probably read our Bibles back then, but we should have. And so when we moved to Lenore City, I thought, well, great, we've got a Ruby Tuesday. And I've gone there 5 or 6 times, made the prime timers go there once. It was the worst. It was the worst. I mean, they'll never go back. They'll never take my suggestion again for where we eat. But so today, after church, Mona and I decided, let's try that again. We'll get a salad. We'll go. So we went over there, and they're consistent, and they produce the same results they have all the time. Mona said to me halfway through the meal, how important is it to you that this is a good restaurant? And I said, well, I kind of want it to be. And she goes, well, yeah, I think you're going to be disappointed. So what happened? We're just sitting there, just like you guys. And the truth is, Mona and I both have had a pretty amazing couple of weeks. I've just been in the Ukraine I've just been in Florida meeting with the Ukrainian staff, hundreds of stories to tell. Mona went to Peru with a missions organization, and she actually spent 3 nights in the Amazon. Just something I would never want to do, but I do love my wife, and she's welcome to go do that. So we had lots to talk about. I was at the Johnny and Friends camp without her, and so there was lots to talk about. But I wasn't feeling great, and Skylar was kind of acting up a little bit, and so we just sat there for a minute, and we were both just a little bit bored. And then Mona picked up her phone and started looking through some things on the phone, and I thought, we should look at the phone. I'll pick up mine. And what happened at that moment is neither one of us were willing to push through the boredom or just the little bit of uncomfortableness. For a relationship to grow, you always have to risk for the sake of growth. And so there's a moment where we're just sitting there in silence, and we both started looking at our phones. And there's nothing wrong with looking at your phone. But we were sitting right across from each other with great stories to tell from the last couple of weeks. And what happened is there was sometimes an awkwardness before you do something that matters. Sometimes there's a hesitation. Sometimes you don't get to creativity till you walk through boredom. Sometimes you don't get to intimacy till you walk through some vulnerability or some risk to one another. And so for whatever reason, maybe it was just I was tired, maybe it's been a long week, or, we just sat there and we chose to do something numbing and safe instead of a little more curious and engaging. Does that make sense? Now, if you understand the dynamics of the story I just told, you understand the genesis of addiction. Ultimately, an addiction is a refusal to struggle and sorrow and live in your present reality the way it is. And so I'm going to separate from the difficult or the boredom and I'm going to try to find something that will numb me from living in sorrow and pain. And so it's really a commitment to not sorrow and not struggle and not live on God's terms on earth. And there's the Wrights are here, and they were discipled by Larry Crabb, who's if you want to read anything on counseling, read anything Larry Crabb wrote ever. He's just really brilliant guy. He died last year, and he tells a story that he said that a guy came into his office once and said, "I want to feel better fast, Doc." And evidently, you probably tell the story better than I could, but evidently Larry Crabb, looked up, and he's real thoughtful, sort of, kind of, and he said, well, if you want to feel better fast, I'd recommend some loose women and maybe a case of liquor and going to the Bahamas. And this guy looked at him like, and he said, that does, what's wrong? And he said, well, that doesn't sound very Christian. And he said, well, if you wanted a Christian answer, you need to ask a different question. If you want to feel better fast, I'd recommend the devil. But if you want to feel better, if you want to be transformed, if you want to live in truth, because Jesus actually calls himself truth, instead of just trying to numb yourself from circumstances, if you want to really live in such a way that that you walk through circumstances instead of bypassing them, then I'd recommend Jesus. And so I'm not sure what the guy chose. I mean, maybe in the Bahamas at this very moment still, but what Crabb was trying to get at is that what's underneath addiction is really idolatry. Another way to talk about that middle ground of addiction, the nature-nurture, is that we are made by God to want to worship. We are people who long to have affiliation. We don't want to be hurt, but we want affiliation. I want to be loved, but I don't want to be rejected. And that tension that we have to not be hurt will sometimes create a strategy, and often that will look a lot like addiction. We're made by God to be people who worship. You worship something. When somebody says, well, I'm not Christian, I don't believe in that, they believe in something. Because a human being is made, we're a worship machine. If you don't believe that, we become crazy in our country about things we worship. Social influencers. My goodness gracious. 10 years ago, you would tell me that there's people that just get online and there's guys who play with Nerf guns. That's what they do. And people sign in and they watch him play with a Nerf gun. Skylar's done it. He thinks it's really the coolest thing in the world. And I think, what a fantasy world that we can go to. And so it's not that God does. It's not God says it's not okay for you to enjoy art or play a video game from time to time, or to be distracted a little bit by golf or something from time to time. But a life of distraction from the real world God's placed you in to live and make a difference in is the genesis of addiction. I'm not going to live on God's terms. I won't suffer. I won't struggle. I will find relief and revenge, and I will go to something. And what you can go to is pretty amazing. I mean, you can. We are so good at. We are so good at being idol worshipers or worshiping less. And remember, we talked about anxiety was that we want to control things. And some people want to pick a less wild lover than God. And what I mean by that is God loves you, but God is not predictable. God is not safe. How did C.S. Lewis say it? He said in the Chronicles of Narnia, that beautiful thing where he says, he found out that Aslan's a lion, and the kid and the beaver person says, no, it's the little boy that says to the beaver person, you want to get this right because you want to make sure you're quoting the beaver. And he says, is he a lion? Is he safe? And Lewis's line back is, of course he's not safe, but he's good. And at the heart of an addiction is I want something safe that I can worship, that I can control, that will help me not struggle or sorrow or suffer. Does that make sense? Now, what's funny about when we use that definition, it changes it from kind of the people that are addicted and the rest of us good people. But when you start looking at addiction as an idolatrous relationship with a substance, a thing, an activity, or a person, that blocks temporarily the pain of living in a fallen world. When all of a sudden addiction is defined as an idolatrous movement of the heart, we're all on that continuum. We're all on that continuum. And that's what is important when you think about addiction, is that since at the core it's idolatry, you and I are all susceptible to trying to find a less wild lover than God that we can control, or we think we can control. It's funny, we become our habits, the incredible spiritual forming of our habits. And whatever you love, whatever you worship, starts to become ingrained in your soul. I've told you lately that one of my struggles at times has been this idea that what's going to happen to Skylar when we die. And because of that, sometimes I get afraid. Sometimes I wonder, have I saved enough money? Have I made enough? Maybe I can get some more money. Maybe I, and sometimes there's a little bit of a panic that goes with that. And that's okay. But when I start looking at my bank account every other day, or when I start, then all of a sudden that money starts to become that nest egg starts to become my idol, and it's amazing how much I'm looking for those things that I think will heal me or help me. I was talking with somebody 2 weeks ago. They don't go to this church, don't worry. That was telling me that they're doing really well financially, and their accountant said you can use your business to lease a car, because that way you can let your business just pay for your car. I mean, you'll essentially get a free car. And she said, I can't do that. And the guy said, why? I mean, look, I'm showing you on paper. You can make the kind of money. This is how that'll go, and you'll do better. And she said, I grew up poor, and every car I had until I was in my 30s was repossessed. Even the car my dad gave me in college, they came and got one time. That's it. And I can't give up that control to let somebody else own my car. And she's in her late 40s. And there's that fear that's created a pattern. And that pattern has created a habit. And she said to me, she goes, I look at this person is making, the reason they ended up talking to me is they're a psychologist, and they have a private practice with 15 counselors working for them. Every counselor that works for them gives them 20% of whatever they make. If this person didn't do another session, they're doing really, really well. And I remember saying, so let's just go ahead and settle this. You're not working for money anymore. Because if you quit now and just ran your practice, you'd live on more money than most people have. You'd be upper middle class. I mean, you may not be able to get a condo in Belize, but you could do just about anything else you want. And so let's just go ahead and acknowledge you're not working for money. So what is it you're working for? And this person checks their balance every single day. They wake up, and that's the first thing they do, and it's because that's where they think those habits, those spiritual habits, that's where they think life is going to be found for them. And it's a Christian counselor in another city that has a practice, and a very successful one. But what is going on there is the beginning of a spiritual habit, a soulish habit that's going to destroy her eventually. And that's, if you understand her story, if you understand us at the Ruby Tuesday today, if you understand the idea that all of us are idol makers, then you understand what is the beginning of addiction. How do you know somebody is moving toward an addiction as opposed to just garden variety idolatry? Since we're all on that continuum, when does it start moving to addiction? And that's when the physiological part's going to get in, and some of the decision making is going to get in as well. But let's just talk about a couple of those things. One of the things, this would be under the heading on our notes of how do you know it's moving toward addiction versus just regular old idolatry. Now, don't misunderstand my phrase there. Regular old idolatry is still sin. I'm not minimizing that. I'm just saying that, regular old idolatry is sin, but when it starts moving in a more specialized or more focused way, that's that beginning of addiction. And so, what are some signs? Well, the first one I'd suggest is withdrawal. Withdrawal is just kind of a fancy way of saying that when as I continue to do whatever I'm doing, I need more of that substance to get, I'm sorry, withdrawal would be the idea that you pay a price when you quit using. So if now it wouldn't be the case because the internet's all over the place. But I remember I went on a cruise once and there was no internet and therefore no email. And when I was a professor, email was how everything got communicated. And so I remember the first 2 days on the cruise, I was like a heroin addict on the street, looking for when I could possibly go into the city or get off the boat, and I could go to a cafe and get on the internet. And I was literally just kind of going through withdrawal. If you're a big coffee drinker, and that's the most important thing I've ever said. If you're a big coffee drinker and you quit drinking coffee, thank you. If you quit drinking coffee, what happens? You get a headache. Why is that? That's withdrawal. It's withdrawal from caffeine. And you go, well, yeah, but it's just coffee. You're right. It's just coffee, but it is a drug and it is a stimulant. And if you get really anxious, if you can't get your coffee, you don't have to go into rehab or anything, but I'm just telling you, you're addicted to caffeine. And because your body gets used to it. And then your body just sets, this is kind of back to the physiological piece, your body kind of says, okay, here's what we need. We're used to caffeine, that's what we want. If you don't give me caffeine, you'll get a headache. Your body's saying, I want that. That's the first thing. The first thing that you have is withdrawal. So if you're, if I'm, I'll be sad when I kind of like the Olympics. I'll probably be sad a little bit when they're done because it's kind of fun to have in the background. But I'm not going to go into withdrawal. I'm not going to start shaking by the TV and saying, why can't we have longer Olympics? But there are some people that when that goes off, that it's been such an important piece, it'll be like, what do I do? But that's not an addiction because there's not really withdrawal. As somebody who looks at porn, when they quit looking, they'll feel a compulsion that they didn't feel when they were using. I love the way C.S. Lewis talks about our habits and would say that he's not impressed with the addict who struggles. He's, when the addict says, well, you don't know because you've never done it. He says, no, that's the strong one. The one that hasn't used substances to get through life. That's the strong one. That's the one who's got resolve, not the, so when the guy says, well, you don't understand. No, you don't understand what it's like to say no to your desires. Lewis said a great quote that has to do with addiction. He said, our problem is not that we want too much, is that we settle for too little. And that is, if I could say one, if underneath everything I say about addiction, if you remember that quote, I think you've got an idea of That's what it is. An addiction is is somebody who doesn't want too much of something, but is afraid of what God would have for them. So they'll take something cheaper, easier that they can control, and they think that gives them control. But the crazy thing of an addiction is eventually it turns on you, and the thing that you thought would give you life. Gosh, when I first saw these pictures, I felt so alive, and it was such. Then it becomes something you can't control. When I first started drinking, boy, I loved feeling that sense of, being a little buzzed. Now I can't do without that. When I begin to, there's that sense of withdrawal. Does that make sense? Second thing you'll notice when somebody goes from garden variety idolatry and moves toward addiction, the next thing I would want to suggest to you is not just withdrawal, but they develop tolerance. And tolerance is the idea that you need more of something to get the same result because your body has become more efficient at it. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And the reason I don't exercise, and there's so many good medical reasons to not, the reason I don't exercise is the body is so efficient. I don't know if you knew this, but if you just, if only thing you ever did was walk, or you went to the gym, at least I'm told there's a room where people actually go in and exercise. If you were to go in there and every time you do the stair machine, eventually your body becomes more efficient at doing that exercise. And it doesn't continue to have the same impact because your body, God built you to become more efficient at things. And so if you wanted to burn 1,000 calories, and when you first started exercising, that didn't take long. But you keep doing the exact same exercise. That's why some people will do these cross trainings and orange therapy and all these different deals. And the reason they do that is because they know the research says that your body becomes kind of tolerant and learns those things. That's a beautiful thing God built in you. Our body, fearfully and wonderfully made, gets more efficient at things as it is exposed to it. And that's a good thing. However, that good thing can become hijacked. And that's what ultimately happens with an addiction. When you begin to use something too much for its ability to numb or its ability to dissociate or pull you away from the things, what eventually happens is your body becomes more efficient at dealing with alcohol. I was never a really big drinker, but I remember in high school, 8 or 9 of us would share one beer, and I'm not sure if we really all got drunk or we just pretended to be drunk on Friday nights, but it was like one little beer between 8 of us that someone snuck out of their house. Welcome to the 70s. And, and now, that one beer wouldn't make any impact at all. And not that I drink beer that often. I'm just saying that there's a way in which whatever you use, your body is made to become more efficient at over time. And so that's true. Many of you are in medicine. This has happened with Skylar many times. The medicine that he's on for his seizures no longer are effective. And so we either have to go up with a different dose, we go to a different medicine for his seizures because his body has become pretty good at handling that drug. And so the idea of tolerance is just another idea of where your body is working the way that God meant for it to work. If you just think about it, if you just think about the progression of sexuality in America media. In my lifetime, it's not like I'm 400 years old, in my lifetime, on a sitcom, men and women, married men and women, had twin beds, and the rule was they could never film them without their feet touching the ground. And so if you watch the old Dick Van Dyke Show or some of those old shows, what you'll notice is, this married couple has twin beds, and you're thinking, that's kind of weird. And then you'll notice that in every scene, even if they're talking in the bedroom, their feet are always on the floor. Fast forward 45 years. I mean, it's crazy. And what happened? Well, what was tantalizing then isn't feel tantalizing anymore. And so you need more stimulus to get that same jolt. It's harder to shock the system. We've seen so much crazy stuff in media. To shock the system almost needs just crazy stuff. And that's because we've developed a tolerance over time. Even just our language. We watched a show this past year that I wouldn't recommend, and I'm not sure if this is a confession or if this is just telling you, but the language in it was so offensive that I think 15 years ago I wouldn't have made it through 4 or 5 episodes. It was the show was Ted Lasso. It's on Apple TV, and it was this. Sadly enough, it was a very positive story about one person could make a difference in a culture, and that just intrigued me. So I kept watching, but the language and some of the sexuality stuff in it was horrific, and I remember not turning it off and just saying, well, this will be, we'll just, we'll get through this part. We'll get back to the good part of the show. But there was a time where that would have shocked me. I would have said, they said that on TV? And now it's like, well, of course that's going to be on TV. I just don't need to watch that. Does it make sense? So don't go watch the show. I'm just saying that to me, it was a personal example of where a standard that I would have had a couple of years ago, slowly, because of so much being inundated by something, you become to the point where you don't notice it as much. And then when you don't notice it as much, you become tolerant of it. Does that make sense? And so the second thing you'll notice if you're moving from garden variety idolatry to a full-blown addiction is you'll notice not only withdrawal, but you'll notice tolerance. Third thing I would suggest that you'll notice is natural consequences do not change behavior. For most of us, natural consequences change your behavior. If I came in tomorrow and I had a 8 o'clock meeting and I got in here at 8:15, and I was met by the entire elder board and Seth, and I was told, you're late one more time. You're out of here. Now, I don't think that would happen, but if it did, I think I'd change my behavior, because natural consequences for most of us change behavior, right? If you got a ticket for doing a rolling stop, where you didn't stop your car the whole way, my guess is the next few months, you're gonna look twice and make sure that car stops, because a $300 ticket has a great way of changing behavior, right? So consequences for most things change behavior. A sign that you've moved from regular old, because it's starting to move into habit, is that natural consequences don't change your behavior. So don't quote me on the exact numbers, but I'm going to give you numbers so that you'll think I'm an expert, and I'm making these numbers up. But the point I'm making is accurate. And by memory, I think this is pretty close. If you get a DUI, and I'm not going to have a show of hands, but if you have a DUI, one DUI, chances are about 50-50 you have a problem with alcohol. Because why? Well, not every time you drink and drive would you get caught, and so if somebody gets caught drinking and driving, chances are they've done that enough times and they've been caught by it. So if you have one DUI, the chances of you being alcoholic go up about 50% over people who don't. But if you get a second DUI, the odds that you're an alcoholic go up to about 80%. Now, why is that? Well, but for most of us, if you got one DUI, it would be, I'm never going to be humiliated like that again. I almost lost my license. I'm not going to, for most people, that consequence would change your behavior. And if that consequence doesn't change your behavior and you get a second one, the chances go way up that you're an alcoholic. And if you have a third DUI, the chances are, in the high 90s that you're an alcoholic or there's an addiction. And why? Because most people, even people who drink, most people do not get a DUI in their life. And the vast majority of the population that drinks does not get a DUI. So if you get one, there's a sign that you're more likely to be an alcoholic than the typical population. However, it could happen one time. But because consequences change behavior in healthy people, if it's the second time, it goes way up. Does that make sense? So consequences are supposed to impact how we behave. If somebody is struggling with addiction, that momentum has shifted in their brain, that system for God has been hijacked, and they will, and it won't change their behavior. I had a pastor that I worked with in Tampa, and whenever he would go out of town, he would go to a strip club. And I remember him calling me once from the parking lot, and I remember saying, I was trying to appeal to better behavior, and I said, not only is this sin, but if you get caught, if somebody from your church sees you walk in there, you'll lose your job. Your kids will lose the ability to go to school. You'll lose your house. You'll lose your vocation. There are consequences to you going in there right now that would destroy your life and your ministry. And he said, I know. I'm just going to go ahead and go. And I said the truth is, he didn't feel like he had much choice sitting in the car out in front of the strip club. He really should have made his choice earlier in the week when he realized he was going to be out of town by himself with money in his pocket. That decision should have been made earlier, but it didn't feel like he had much choice in the moment, though he did. So that's that idea that consequences don't change behavior. So remember I said nature, nurture, choice. There is a choice piece to addiction, obviously. And that's, and the people from the disease model go, well, no, it's not, they'll go, why did you drink? You drink because you're sick and you got a disease. And these people kind of go, well, I think maybe he's drinking because he made a choice to go to a bar. Maybe if he hadn't made that choice first. And so it's so much more complicated than the two groups try to say. These people try to just say it's all moral. It's just a moral choice. And there is a moral choice involved, is there not? And these people say, oh, it's just a disease, it's the brain. And it's like, no, it is a weaving together of nature, nurture, and choice that, and the hijacking of a reward system that God built that is now moving in the wrong direction because of your choices. Fourth thing that you'll notice if you're moving from a garden variety idolatry to a full-blown addiction is isolation and relational struggle. There's a fascinating study done there was a doctor there was a psychologist who was doing studies on mice and rats and opiate addiction. And so they were just, they would just jack these mice up on, on stuff, and then they would, they would see what they would choose. They would choose food, or would they choose more opiates? What would they do? And so one of the little assistants, or one of the graduate assistants that was working with him, as they're putting the rats back in after they jacked them up full of all this stuff, one of them said, if I had to live in that dirty little cage, I'd probably use drugs too. And so that got this researcher kind of interested. And so what he did is he built a kind of a mouse Disney World. There were other mice, and what they found is eventually these mice would choose food over the opiates and choose relationship over the opiates. And it was like, maybe some of addiction is a relationship problem. And that sometimes what happens when people start to get addicted, they begin to isolate. They begin to not tell people what they're doing. They begin to live in a fantasy world that they're trying to live in. And so and that's one of the symptoms of an addiction is your relationships get in trouble. Now, we actually did an experiment in our world that kind of proves how important relationships are. After the Vietnam War, many, many men came home addicted to opiates, because back then they didn't know some of the dangers, and if you were if you were hurt, you'd get jacked up with opiates, and opiates were there by the truckloads, and a lot of soldiers came home addicted. But then they came home, they left the battlefield, and for the most part, they came home to homes and relationships and people. And the vast majority of them, not all of them, but the vast majority of Vietnam vets who came back without a treatment plan, but just because relationships became enriched, got off opiates. Why are opiate addictions? Why are addictions kind of increasing in our culture? So I think we're disconnected. One of the signs that you're struggling with an addiction is going to be that you begin to isolate. You begin to isolate from your family, from people that know you, and you begin to, and it's almost like you're having an affair with a substance or an activity, and it's hard to have, and so you're kind of being unfaithful. Because you're always thinking, which is another sign of an addiction, and that's a focused attention upon the activity or the thing you're addicted to. Because you're always thinking about, how do I get the next one? Or how do I go to the next place? And so, you don't go to a party unless they're going to have alcohol, or you don't, and you start changing your friends to people who agree with whatever you're doing. So, and you can find on the internet, that's what's crazy about the internet, you can find a group of people that, you can find people that worship anything on the internet. You can find people that, think they're going to die and become a Tonka toy truck in a garage in Buffalo or something. And you'll find somebody who goes, I've got someone who understands me. And it's like, you'll create a community that will support your bad behavior. And so you start moving down. That's why the successful programs like AA, they put you in a community and there's relationships around you. The Renew Clinic that we operate here, or that we helped operate, I'll tell you the secret sauce. Now, they may disagree with me, but the secret sauce is that they are committed to Christ, and they try to make that group that the people go to an incredible caring community for one another. So much so that when people graduate from the 12-week program at Renew, many of them come back and just want to hang out, because it's like, people have loved me, people care about me. There's some of them they haven't been able to get rid of. It's like, they're back. And because there's something about that community. My first job, and this is kind of how I ended up going into counseling instead of high school math teacher and basketball coach. But My first job when I got out of undergraduate, I couldn't find a job, and I took a job at an addiction clinic. I had no background in counseling. I knew nothing about it. I was a math teacher and a basketball coach, but somehow they were pretty desperate, and so I became, and that was part of God's sovereign plan of my life. If you were to say the story of my life should be called "Sovereign Stumbling," I think is a phrase that that Crabb used to use as well. It's just like God's been sovereign, and I've stumbled for a long, long time, and it's been beautiful in that sense. But I think this was one of those things. I ended up in this place, and I remember they had me take people to an AA meeting, and so every week I would pull up the van, all these alcoholics it was a non-medical detox. So I mean, they're shaking, they're drinking Gatorade. I mean, it's raw, and so they're getting in and they're just shaking, and I go, hey, we're going to AA, and I would drive down to the Flatiron Building downtown. We'd get out and we'd go in, and I remember after about 6 weeks. And when it got to me at an AA meeting, they say, hi, my name's Jim Coffield. My name's Jim. You don't say a last name. I'm Jim, and I'm an alcoholic, or I'm Jim, and I'm just checking things out. And so the first 6 or 7 weeks, I said, it got to my turn. I said, I'm Jim Coffield, and I'm here. I work at Dry, and I'm here with some of my friends. And I remember driving home one day and thinking, gee, I wish I could say I was an alcoholic. Now, isn't that a weird thing to say? Of course I don't want to be an alcoholic, but I saw the way they cared for each other, and I saw the community that they were creating, and I saw the way that they engaged each other, and whenever a new person came in, it was really kind of funny. Whenever a new person would come in and say, my name's Bob, and I'm just checking things out, the whole group would shift to, hey, let's do a first step meeting today, and which was just trying to help the guy admit he's an alcoholic, and so the whole group would just shift, and this person would go, I think they're talking to me. And it was beautiful in a way. But what made it work was it was community caring for one another. And that's why Renew Clinic works so well. They have some good curriculum, and they love Jesus, and there's a lot of prayer, but the kind of the secret sauce is they create a community. And they do such a good job of it. Their numbers are just absolutely through the roof. But you probably remember those. What are the numbers for like?
No pressure. Like the 30, 60, 90.
Yeah, for 90 days out.
It's probably 4 times, if not more, what the average is. I think the average is like 22% for 30 days, and ours are somewhere in the 86.
Yeah, the average treatment center, 90 days out, only about 22% of the people are remaining sober. And Renew Clinic, they're in the high 80s, 90s. So it's like, how's that happen? Well, it's because God's showing up and they're trusting God with. But one of the things, they create a community, because what's the opposite of addiction? An addiction is ultimately a relational problem as well, and so you pull away from relationship. And remember this phrase: for the most part, relationships have been used to hurt you in your life, and usually God will use relationships in the healing process. First with Him, and then with others. You've got to think of, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? God is a relational God. I mean, I'll let one of the seminarians, not cemeterians. That'd be a Freudian slip, but if you don't know what that phrase means, it's okay. I would let one of the seminarians here maybe do a special class on the Trinity, and they could spend the rest of their lives kind of explaining all that. But just to say that whatever all the Trinity means, God is one in three, and somehow in relationship with one another, the paraclesis, the pouring into one another. There's something about the nature of God that is relational in its design. And you're creating the image of that. And it's okay to be an introvert, and it's okay not to, but a healthy person is going to have relationships. And one of the things that happens that shows you've got a sign that you're dealing with an addiction is it's going to have a negative impact on your relationships. It's going to have an isolating effect on your life. The preoccupied, the next symptom would be just a preoccupation with the substance or the activity. Next would be the idea that usually a sign of an addiction is somebody has said they're going to quit and they can't. There's usually been many, many attempts to quit something and they can't. And so when somebody comes into me, and I don't ever argue about are they an addict or not, I just usually say, well, listen, why don't we prove everybody wrong? You are, your wife has sent you here. You've had 2 DUIs. Everybody's kind of thinking that you're an alcoholic. Why don't you prove everybody wrong? What do you say we take the next 12 weeks and just meet together and you just to kind of commit to not drinking for the next 12 weeks. Now, there's no reward, no punishment, but you just have to be honest with me. And why do we do that? And you can prove everybody wrong. And they'll go, okay. And, maybe last a week, maybe 2 weeks. But by that 3rd week, if they've not done something honest and spiritual to help them, they're going to be drinking again. And they come back and they usually have a lot of shame. And I'll say, so you tried to quit and couldn't. Let's talk about what that might mean. And so usually somebody who has an addiction has tried many, many times to stop. Maybe over and over again to stop. And instead they've not been able to. Does that make sense? Now think for a minute, both in your own life, what things act like addiction in your life? What are some things that's hard to let go of? Feel like you need more and more of it? Feel like you would pursue it almost no matter what? It kind of gets in the way of your relationships. There's a lot of things that I think I think your phone can be that. I think the internet can be that. I think Facebook can be that. I think sports can be that. Gambling is one of the interesting things around college campuses today is the incredible problem with addiction to gambling. Most things that you can get addicted to have a reward system that is not that's not fixed. In other words, I don't know that every time I pull down I'm going to win. So if I didn't win this time, I'll pull it down because I might win the next time. There's something about that really kind of increases the use of something like gambling. There's so much stuff that we could easily, because there's so many things that can become our idols. There's so many things that we become addicted to. Now, then there's stuff that, if you drink too much coffee, maybe I'm not a medical doctor and go ahead and drink coffee, I guess. It's not going to impact it's probably not going to have the same level of impact that these other things do. But almost anything can be slid into that space of I want relief and revenge. I want to live in a fallen world and not have to pay the price. It's ultimately a way that we numb ourselves. Or another word that sometimes people use is we dissociate from it. Now, everybody dissociates some. You probably have today. If you get bored in a class, you dissociate. It's like, sometimes when people are a lot smarter than me, like Andrew, who preached this morning, there's a part of me that sometimes I'll find myself, going away a little bit. It's like, well, why am I going away? It's because, well, I have no idea what he's talking about, and I'm not smart enough to figure it out. And so that's completely true, but that's called dissociation. That's when I dissociate. I pull away from being present with that. And one of the beauties of though God did allow our brains to do that, it's really a protective mechanism for children. It's not a great mechanism for adults to figure out their lives, to dissociate, to be pulled away. And alcohol or any numbing activity can include those sort of things. Does that make sense? A couple other things you ought to know about people that are ready to get help for addiction. First of all, they feel all alone. They feel like they can't change. Many times they'll feel like it's too late to change because they've tried so many times to change. You'll find a lot of their support system, because you need support system to change, right? They've kind of burned a lot of bridges usually. I mean, somebody who's kind of lost in the addictive thing, they've burned a lot of bridges. I mean, they've stolen money from their parents, and they've wrecked cars, and they've done things that kind of the people that you would normally go to for help, um, they've kind of pulled the rug out from under those people. A lot of times, if I'm dealing with somebody for the first time and they're coming to me for help, I say, and my question to them, and I try not to say it judgmentally at all, but my question is, so help me understand how you've lived your life to this point, where the only man you can go to for help is a stranger. Because most of you are healthy people in here. And if you had a mild crisis or a big crisis, there's 20 people you can call. I mean, if you all left tonight and I stayed and did some work and I came out and I had a flat tire, and I guess I could change the tire. We'll just make this story up a little bit more. But there's 20 people I could call and say, hey, got a minute coming back, and let's help me out. But what happens with a lot of people that are in the place of addiction, because they have been having an affair, if you will, with this activity, they've burnt the bridges of all the people that should be supportive to them, and you don't blame them. I mean, I don't blame somebody for not letting their addict son back in their home after he's stolen everything or taken everything, and so and that's why one of the important things. Remember, in all treatments, you need three things to get better. You need the Word of God, or truth. You need the Spirit of God. And you need the people of God. I mean, in any real change, real transformation, you need all three of those things. And truth can come, I mean, obviously the Bible's truth, but also from an honest counselor, or from honest friends, and then you need the community of God, the community of God's people, and you need the Spirit of God to really make transformation, change, and stick. Let's take a break for just a second and stop and say, any questions about that? I've been talking about kind of the dark side of desire, if you will. So any questions about that? Yeah. Well, usually addiction rates are lower in cultures that have better community, but you're capable of. I mean, so you live in a world. Nepal is a fairly poor area. There's not. You're going to teach me as I say the wrong things, but in a place like Nepal, the first thing you do in the morning is try to get enough water, and then you make sure you have enough food for the day, and that may take most of the day. And then the next day you start over again. And the next day you start over again. And if there's a catastrophe and you didn't get water one day, you don't have enough for the next day. And so, what is, even though the community is really good, they're helping each other, there is a level of stress, starting over every day, trying to get your needs met, having limited resources, and so instead of thinking about how little I have, if I drink and get drunk, I don't feel that for a while, and I think that's where you'd probably find in those sort of, in a lot of the more poorer countries, you'll see those addictions to opiates or things that they can find, but it's usually stuff that's indigenous to their area, because they're dealing with the same thing. I mean, you were made for heaven, and you were made for Eden, and you live in neither place. And so one way to say this without sounding like Eeyore is that there's something wrong with everything on this side of heaven. Well, that sounds really negative, but it's true. My very best of moment is never pure motives. The most beautiful thing in the world is never quite as beautiful as you would hope. Um, and so, because there's a little bit wrong with everything. Um, and with that reality, I either learn to live in that sorrow and loss with integrity and trust God with my life, or I try to find something cheaper and easier to kind of numb the pain. And that's ultimately the issues of addiction. Yes. So the question is, how do I navigate a situation where someone I love is an addict and I've burned all their bridges? Um, First of all, I think sometimes we have a cheap definition of love. We sometimes think love always makes somebody feel better. That's not true. Sometimes love challenges. Every time I speak in church, I don't know if you notice this, but I always say the same prayer. And I will say, for the people that are, I don't know if you've noticed I say this, but for the people too comfortable, use this time to disrupt them. For the people that are disrupted, use this time to comfort them. And for all of us, equip us for your glorious plans. And the reason I say that is I think real love, good teaching, to whatever level I'm teaching accurately, will be both disruptive and enticing. It'll challenge as well as encourage. And so we have a definition of love in our culture. Sometimes it's like, no, if I love somebody, I'm always going to do whatever they want. And if you see me, if I came in here eating with a pizza box underneath the thing and I had food hanging off my beard, you should tell me. You should say, Jim, I'm not sure you need that third large pizza today, because that's loving me. And I think when I think of your brother, sister, cousin, uncle, aunt, whoever it is, and you don't have to tell us, the fact that you're wrestling with it means you love them. And I think what we as Christians need to do is make sure there's always an entrance ramp back into relationship. But somebody who's an addict has lost the right to define how they enter. You get to define that. So I have a guy that started calling me. He was a student of mine at Bryan College 30 years ago. And he remembered some conversation we had, and he got my number or found it or something. And he called me and he said, I'm an alcoholic and my life hasn't gone the way I've wanted it to. And, will you help me? And I said, well, sure. I'll bet you I can find you a place to stay. Why don't you come to Knoxville and go to Renew Clinic? I know the people there. There's other clinics, and he goes, well, I'm not into those kind of groups sitting around talking. And I said, listen, I'm sorry, but your ways of trying to fix this haven't worked. And the fact that you've called me broken, needing a place, tells me that you've kind of lost the ability to make the decision if you're wanting my involvement, if you want me to get you a place to stay, if you want my involvement, then you're giving up some of that right to do it your way. But one of the things that you'll sometimes find with addicts is they're just committed to doing things their way. And it's like, well, I thought you'd love me. I thought you'd support me. I will. I'll be glad to. But right now, what support looks like is that you go to, you get detoxed and you go into treatment, and we'll help. We might help cover the cost of some of that, but we're not just gonna. It's not like today you want to try harder and okay, we all go back to zero, because they have lost the right to define how they get better, because they haven't. Do you know what I mean? As soon as someone says, think of it borrowing money. If somebody says, hey, I need to borrow, $500. And I live next to my son Pierce, and he lives in the house next door to us. And if he came to me today and said, "Dad, I need to borrow, $1,000," um, if he really wants to borrow it, and then I see him, buying a wooden widget that he doesn't need, and they're going on to some concert, and I'm not going to a concert because I'm working on Saturday. It's like, wait a minute, if it's a gift, you can use it for whatever you want. But since you need help, and you've come to me, you've lost the right to do whatever you want with it. If you want to do whatever you want, get your own money. But if you're coming to me and saying I need $1,000, I have the right to say, yeah, but you can't use this for entertainment. This needs to go on your bills, or this needs to, because you're asking for my involvement, and that would be the loving thing to do. It's really. I know we don't know each other really well, but your compassion for whoever this is obvious. I mean, when you talk about it, your eyes are soft, your shoulders drop. I mean, it's like, what do we do? What do we do? And so I would bet most of us in this room have somebody like that we hurt for. We see them taking the wrong path. And there should always be an invitation to get back on the interstate. I mean, there's always an entrance ramp. However, you don't get to determine, you don't get to choose everything that happens as you're getting on the interstate, because you're asking for my help. And some people will at first, balk at that, but usually, if somebody really wants to change, they'll usually say that, and that's the choice piece, nature, nurture, choice. They'll go, okay, I'll do it. And this guy that told me, I'm just not into groups and 12 steps. I said, well, it doesn't sound like it doesn't sound like your strategy's worked. And it sounds like this is one of the things that works. And so if you're not willing to do this, then I'm sorry, but I'm not going to call my friends and find a place for you to stay, and I'm not going to make sure, I'll give you enough food and stuff like that. If you were next door to me, I wouldn't turn away for that, but I'm not going to participate in his addiction. And there's even a lot of, there's what happens in families is usually the addiction, whoever has an addiction becomes the focus, part of the focus of the family. And so much though that most of AA and all those sort of things actually have other groups called Al-Anon, where for families to help them learn how to deal with people that are addicted. At Renew Clinic, we have a whole coaching program that kind of works with families and helps them do that way, because you get caught up in a system that ends up inadvertently contributing to the person's mess, and we don't want to do that. So, a couple of things. Dark side of desire. We could talk obviously about relationships. That's a kind of codependency. We could talk about sexuality. When most sexuality in America is not about passion, but about escape, quite frankly. Food can be an addiction. That's a hard addiction, because you have to, while you're going to have to eat. But whereas most addictions are things you can put away. Remember that addictions are maintained by a desire for relief. I don't want to feel the tension, and revenge, anger. This isn't the way I want my life to be. And so that ultimately is, if we were to look at Ephesians 4, 17 through 19, let me just read it to you, and I'll just kind of. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord. You must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and are separated from life of God because of their ignorance that is in them due to their hardening of hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality and so indulge in every kind of impurity and continual lust for more. If you kind of follow that passage, ignorance shifts to hardness. Hardness shifts to loss of sensitivity. And then that's the interior of addiction then becomes an indulgence for sensuality, to feel something. And so the interior of addiction is ignorance, hardness, and loss of sensitivity. The exterior of addiction is sensuality, indulgence, and continual lust. Real quick, the things that a person who's addicted will feel: I'm crazy, I'm alone, I'm unforgivable, and I'm hopeless. All those are not true. But that's what somebody who's lost in addiction begins to feel. I'm crazy, I'm alone. Even as I talk about this, usually when I just do a presentation on a regular addiction, I'll hear from somebody that week that'll say, hey, listen to that. I realize that my relationship with food, or my relationship with the internet, or my relationship with something is kind of starting to fall toward that addictive category, and I want to, how do I work with that? And so, so those would be the sign of addictions. Remember, addictions are often kept in the silence and the secrets, and that's why God helps people get better when they bring those out. One writer looks at Romans 1:24 and 25, and it says, therefore God gave them over to their sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies in one another, and they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worship and served created things rather than the Creator, who should forever be praised. And what that's suggesting is that at some level in addiction, God gives people what they say they want. Yeah, I want to feel better fast. I want to be numb. I don't want to hurt anymore. And at some level, though, initially God has built a system to keep that from happening in your brain. Eventually, God gives you over to those things and says, okay, you say what you want is more of this, you can have that. And in doing so, it's a severe mercy that will take a person to the end of themselves. You'll often hear in AA that, that people don't get better till they kind of hit bottom, and I don't think that's necessarily completely true, but there is a point where there does have to be a system that starts to not work before you start to question it. Does it make sense? Remember I said one time that we want to look at the roots, the shoots, and the fruit. And usually what we look at is the fruit. Are they drinking or not? And I think based on Proverbs, where he says, above all else, guard your heart, for out of that flows the issues of life. I think as Christians, we're required to look at the shoots and the roots, not just the fruit. And what you just described so eloquently is what I would call the kind of the root, the fruit, the shoots. It's the thinking. It's the thinking that I have that's going to get me to change. And so a lot of times, there's even a whole kind of theory of counseling, cognitive behavioral counseling. The biblical counseling movement tends to be focused on let's change our thinking, and that's really important and that's helpful. But I consider that the shoots. It's like that's what I'm thinking. What I think is sometimes deeper is that that longing for God and longing for connection and longing for relationship, longing for redemption, which I think is at the very core of a human being, that is sometimes not even noticed in our day-to-day life, but is driving a lot of how we behave. But you just described well that there is, and some people can get better by kind of behavioral things. And if you can get better by just having somebody say, quit doing that and try harder, that's great. If some people need to go a step further and kind of look at the thinking like you're talking about and smoking and logically, that's great. But I think the real transformational change is inside out, not outside in. And it starts with the root and then moves up to the shoot, and then finally, let's deal with the fruit. Sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes if a guy's getting drunk going to work, you don't have time to say, well, what do you think he longs for deep in his soul? You say, you can't drive you can't drive anymore. You can't work here anymore. But I find real change takes place, real change that's transformational change is a heart change, not just a thinking change or not just a behaving change. Though I want to change those things, I think that some of those things sit upstream from what's deeper inside you. Does that make sense? And that happens. I mean, I could see it happening with our grandson next door. I'm just saying. So Mona comes back from Peru, and she said, hi, Jim, and she kissed me, and we said hello, and it was good to see each other. But then she looked at me and said, do you think Cedar's home right now? And I said, well, I don't know, Mona. It's late. Why don't you just see Cedar tomorrow? Well, maybe I'll just go over and just. So it is possible to. Now, whenever you put somebody in that position, you put a lot of pressure on them. God never intended a human being to meet all your needs, including your spouse. God never intended a human being to meet all your needs. And when you put that position on another person, you're really putting an incredible amount of pressure on them, because that's not what a relationship's supposed to do. If you're not careful, another Larry Crabb comment, if you're not careful, you'll end up with 2 ticks and no dog. Two people kind of connected to each other, trying to suck life out of each other when there's nothing of substance to sustain them, and it's just a matter of, and that can often happen when a relationship becomes in that spot that really Christ is supposed to be in. But I think probably the most common addiction is probably to relationships. Sometimes unhealthy relationships, but I think it's probably it's the closest thing to what I think God is offering us in real life. So you guys, be really kind to yourself today. We've talked about, and in one sense, I would like everybody in here to leave a little disrupted and go, I'm on that continuum. There are ways that I could go down a path that would look like addiction. And maybe I've got real socially acceptable addictions like a people pleaser or food, as long as it's not too much, or something. And if you've come to that, God isn't against you. He's for you, and He just wants you to be more dependent on Him. I mean and so He's committed. He's radically committed to your broken system not working. I'm almost finished. I know I'm running a little bit late. In Jeremiah, it says, my people have committed 2 sins. They've turned their back on me, the source of living water, and they've dug for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that don't hold water. If I had to pick a passage that kind of describes what addiction is a broken cistern that you've dug for yourself, but ultimately it won't work. And so what's interesting is this is a story, this passage in Jeremiah, people are in a desert, and it does not say, my people have committed 2 sins. They're thirsty in a desert. It does not say what they long for is wrong. And what you'll find is what you really long for in most of your addictions is something much, much better than just alcohol or a picture of a stranger having sex. I mean, what you really want is real connection and real intimacy and real hope in real life. So the passage in Jeremiah says that the root of addiction, if you will, is I'm not going to depend on God with my thirst, my deep thirst for connection, for life, for a life that matters. I'm not going to depend on God for that. Instead, I'm going to turn my back on Him, the source of living water, and I'm going to just dig my own wells. And ultimately, what an addiction is a thirsty person digging a well. And usually a little bit of water comes up and they go, well, I got some water. And I'm in the desert. And God says, that's poisoned water. And they go, it doesn't matter, it's water. And thus begins addiction. Does that make sense? Hey, you guys listen to me through sneezing and coughing and wheezing, and you deserve like a bonus. So we'll see you next week, and we'll kind of go from there.